From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. In recent years, there has been a growing movement to confront the ugly history of colonialism. In particular, activists have targeted enduring symbols of colonialists and slave traders, such as place names and statues. In Singapore, discussion has centered around the problematic history of Sir Stamford Raffles. Today, we speak to Faris Joraimi, a co-editor of the book Raffles Renounced Towards a Merdeka History, on how we should view the legacy of Raffles, as well as Singapore's history as part of the Malay world. So thanks, Faris, for joining me today. So how does it feel like to be a published author?
Well, I think it's nice that my first kind of crack at being a published author is a collaborative project. So that certainly takes off some of the pressure because it's not, sort of I'm not alone in that project. It's kind of a collaborative work with like 10 other authors. So it's yeah.
So how did you become involved with this book project?
So that started in early 2019. Of course, the bicentennial had just kicked off. I submitted an essay to Channel News Asia, actually CNA. It was an op-ed in response to a pair of installations that had just been staged at the Raffles landing site, both by an artist named Ting Kai Wei. So first was this kind of optical illusion where he made the Raffles statue disappear behind to kind of camouflage itself with the OCBC tower. And then the second one was, the ones where he has lieutenants, 4 other statues kind of surrounding Raffles. I think it was called The Arrivals. That was the title of that work. And I was kind of giving a sort of critical review of those 2 installations with a mind also of complicating the narrative that was being presented by the bicentennial, claiming that they were trying to decenter Raffles, but at the same time, not really. So this kind of contradiction was, I think, at the heart of that piece. But long story short, that piece got rejected. I was telling Alfian this story about this CNA op-ed, and he said, look, I've got a book project coming up. I'm trying to compile a little primer of decolonial texts surrounding Singapore history. So Singapore decolonial texts, and featuring also being accompanied by a set of essays. And so he kind of kindly offered to give that piece a home. And then grew, because then later Merdeka, the play, was being written, and this was sort of going to be a companion guide to that work. And then he joined forces with Dr. Hong Lisa and Dr. Sai Siu Min, both members of the Spores editorial collective. And Spores at the time was also kind of trying to put out a retrospective special issue on the bicentennial, slated to come out in 2020, so the year after that. And eventually it just became this collaborative work between my Alfian, Hong Lisa, Siu Min, and myself. And then of course we reached out to our colleagues and friends for contributions. So that's kind of the origin story from my end. I mean, of course, Siu Min and Alfian have kind of their own sort of different entry points to the project.
The title of the book is Raffles Renounced Towards a Merdeka History. What is the link between Raffles and the discourse around Merdeka?
So I think, first of all, as is discussed at length in the essay, the word Merdeka itself has been completely banished from Singaporean sort of vocabulary. Most recently, it was revived with this Merdeka Generation package, but again, shorn of its anti-colonial connotation, right? It just kind of reinforces this narrative of the pioneering, hardworking sort of, again, quote unquote, pioneer generation, not so much their ideals surrounding Merdeka, etc. During that era, in the 1950s, 1960s, there were debates already about what was going to be done about the Raffles statue. I think leftists, including the late S. Rajaratnam, were also, mulling over whether we should tear down the statue of Raffles, because it's such a clear as day. It is a symbol of imperial rule, and so these people in the anti-colonial movement of that era were under no pretenses that it was a symbol that should at some point be taken down. Of course, it didn't happen because anti-colonialism was defeated, right, in the 1960s. and colonialism reorganized as Euro-American global hegemony. Of course, the left across Southeast Asia was annihilated in the 1960s, and a lot of the authoritarian, quote unquote, post-colonial regimes that followed in Malaysia, in Singapore, and in Indonesia integrated themselves into this new sort of American-dominated order. And in Singapore, as a consequence of that, Raffles was rehabilitated. Right, it was precisely in the backdrop of this Cold War context that Albert Winsemius advised Lee Kuan Yew, don't tear down the Raffles statue. It can be a soothing gesture to a Western capital, signifying Singapore's membership in the free world. So, in a sense, the persistence of, or rather the endurance of the Raffles statue also signifies, in some way, the lingering legacies of colonialism that had not been fully defeated, right? Reorganized into this new Western-dominated global order, and kind of Raffles kind of signifies Singapore's links to that. Our prosperity post-independence was not neutral. Again, it's a result of us integrating ourselves into this new system led by the US and the global North. So I think when we talk about Merdeka, today, it's intimately tied to all these things. How do we untangle ourselves from the dominance of the West that endures? How do we untangle ourselves from the yoke of capital that also endures? Raffles today symbolizes our ties to these things. And of course, our aspiration to, the standards of modernity and civilization that continue to be dictated by the West.
I mean, speaking about statues, in your chapter, quote, Finding Merdeka in a World of Statues, unquote, you criticize the addition of statues of figures such as Tan Tock Seng and even Sang Nila Utama to the riverside near the existing white statue of Raffles. Yeah. Why was this problematic in your opinion?
I mean, isn't it weird that if they really wanted to kind of ground this new approach of history in the local and talk about our other sort of, local pioneers or regional pioneers, why cast them in the likeness of Raffles? Why kind of, again, they're only worth celebrating if they look like a Raffles statue. I think that was, the optics of it was quite strange. So instead of tearing down the Raffles statue, we elevated these pioneers to look like Raffles statues. I mean, again, it's this allergy to this kind of symbolic demolition of colonial symbols. It's something that we cannot do, and the only way that we can, our form of resistance is always to take the local and elevate it to the status of colonial symbols. I mean, it's, then when will it end? You're still, the standard of, what's worth celebrating, what's worth commemorating is still set by the colonial legacy. And the other problem is, of course, that they are temporary statues, right? They didn't go all out to design kind of like a permanent landmark to commemorate all of our local pioneers, be they coolies and indentured labor who built Singapore, or, the heroes of Merdeka, the nationalists, the trade union leaders. I mean, instead of doing that, they set up these temporary statues as a kind of, again, a very clever little joke that say, haha, look, we are trying to decenter Raffles. But then at the end of the bicentennial year, these statues were all taken down, right? And again, it's the Raffles statue that remains. And, as Siu Min in her chapter noted, puffed up and prouder than before, because now he's got, this new 700-year history backing him up.
Yeah, speaking about the Raffles statue, I mean, you also mentioned in your chapter a Facebook post I had written in 2020 about the option of moving the statue of Raffles outside Victoria Theatre to a museum in the future. Now, you agreed with that and also recommended the, quote, ceremonial removal of the statues. What do you mean by this?
So I think the idea of putting Raffles in a museum, the statues in a museum, is good in the sense that you are now kind of relegating him, the statues, as a relic of the past. And then that does a few things, right? Psychologically, the ability for you to stand shoulder to shoulder with Raffles already has a leveling effect. You're not looking up at him standing on a pedestal, with his arms crossed, sort of, looking at the city that he built. So just having him like on ground level, and for you to be able to kind of scrutinize him, already has a lot of symbolic power. You can see the map of the Malay world that he was stepping on. This Thomas Woolner's little creative intervention there to symbolize Raffles' subjugation of the Malay world. You can't see that with him standing up on that high pedestal. You can if he's like, on ground level. So these things, the ability to scrutinize because he's just standing at your level is one. But of course, when people talk about removing the statue, they immediately, because in 2020 especially, this was in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, statues were being torn down left, right, center. I mean, you've got statues of Columbus being thrown into lakes. You've got statues of Columbus being torn down to the sound of drum beats and singing, and all well and good. I mean, because in that context, and a lot of the sort of agitators that were bringing down the Columbus statues were Native American demonstrators, and to them, having to walk past this statue of a man who, literally caused the genocide and disenfranchisement of your people is traumatizing. So to have it done that way, performed in that sort of loud and triumphant manner, serves an important psychological function. Now, for us, I don't know whether the anxiety, therefore, is that when we talk about taking down the Raffles statue, is that, it's these bunch of hooligans and vandals who are trying to like destroy this civic landmark, right? But no, we that doesn't have to be the way. We can dispose of the statue in far more, in a manner that is befitting, a country that's matured past its colonial legacy and is ready to exorcise it from their historical imagination. We're not trying to wipe out colonialism from history. It's a reality that you can't kind of take away. It's happened, right? So again, there are all these voices saying, "Oh, why are you trying to like sanitize history?" We're not. It's a way for us to, in effect, update the way we remember our past. Not through these celebratory civic landmarks. So how do we do it? My suggestion was to have a ceremonial removal. This can be a stately affair. Again, rituals and performances have an important psychological function. And so for us to solemnly declare that we are moving past this deadweight kind of symbol that no longer serves a purpose anymore for us. I mean, look, 60 years of independence, we don't need Raffles to as a founding myth to legitimize our existence here. We've got so much more to anchor that in. So, yeah, we can have this whole quiet ceremony, and bring down statue, maybe read solemn declaration, maybe read Suratman Markasan's poem, The Ballad of a Man in Front of a Raffles statue, read excerpts from Hussein Alatas's Raffles Schemer or Reformer. I mean, there's all this material that can accompany that. And this ritual is important because it's a symbolic reversal of the traumas and wounds inflicted by dark histories, right? And it's a way for us to acknowledge that, okay, Raffles stands for an imperial legacy that brought untold misery and suffering to hundreds of people here. Again, the myth of benevolent colonialism in Singapore is absolute, it's nonsense, I mean, tell that to the hundreds and thousands of coolies, indentured laborers, and Malay peasants who were dispossessed and oppressed by colonial capitalism. I mean, this was not benevolent colonialism in Singapore. So yeah, doing that, I think again, it removes a psychic barrier for us to also begin to finally talk about these things.
The questioning of established historical narratives, the removal of statues around the world last year, sparked strong pushback by those who criticize, quote, wokeness, or argue that the past cannot be judged by today's moral standards. What's your take on this?
Yeah, recently I was at a dinner party where again someone said, well, colonialism is only backed by our moral standards today. So you can't think of it as you can't approach history with an activist posture because, what happened in the past, it has to be judged on its own standards. And sure, I mean, but then, okay, if we follow that line of reasoning, I mean, as early as the 18th century, members of the British Parliament were already condemning the violence being inflicted on locals in India. People were already were already regretting the fact that India had been discovered at all, because the kind of rapaciousness that the East India Company was, plundering the Indian subcontinent, the wealth of the Indian subcontinent, was shocking even to the British public, right? It was scandalous. So, and when people talk about, you have to judge Raffles as by the standards of his time. He was a man of his time. We heard this a lot when the Asian Civilizations Museum was trying to defend their curatorial decisions. And look, even by the standards of his time, he already had his critics. I mean, the officials of the East India Company were already upset with him, with the way he went about doing things. If you read Tim Hannigan and Peter Carey, I mean, a lot of his contemporaries were disgusted by the autocratic way which Raffles carried out the administration of Java. I mean, seriously, like this idea that we should judge things by the standards of his time. First of all, well, even by the standards of their time, the rape and plunder of colonies by imperial powers were already a source of great shame for many Europeans. Many Europeans who visited the colonies. Again, there are lots of these things written down. I mean, sure, they did believe in a sort of natural right to rule. Fight is might is right, etc. But underlying a lot of these comments were also a sense of shame, I think, that of the hypocrisy that was being blatantly on display. They were talking about enlightenment and progress and human civilization, but that wasn't being matched by the way they were treating a lot of their colonies. So again, sure, judge it by the standards of its time. By the standards of its time, colonialism was already seen as a terrible thing. The other problem with talking about today's moral standards or wokeness is that, of course, we aren't putting out this book or talking about Merdeka now because of this, new wave of quote unquote SJW, social justice discourse that's apparently like infecting, the online world and corrupting the minds of our youth. There's a moral panic around this now. Oh dear, like the youths are importing Western values, etc. But
like the so-called culture war.
Yeah, and then the culture war, But if you look at history, I mean, the very fact that people were engaged in an anti-colonial movement shows that ideas of freedom, liberty, justice, I mean, people were clamoring for these things decades ago. No one was saying that colonialism was something that locals found, 100% beneficial. And so, if they did, then there wouldn't have been an anti-colonial movement. There wouldn't have been hundreds of people mobilizing, going out into the streets, petitioning, etc. Clearly, people had wised up to the fact that this was something that needed to be challenged and eventually overthrown. So yeah, wokeness, I mean, sure, whatever. It's, social justice with another name. I'm sure back then people in those, I'm sure, the activists and trade union leaders and radical nationalists of the 50s and 60s were also had their kind of, naysayers and seen as troublemakers, etc., saboteurs, whatever. But this is always, the pushback that any kind of progressive cause invites. Whether or not it's valid is another question.
Aside from your work on Raffles, one of the things that you've written extensively about is, Singapore's relations with the Malay world and the history of Malay culture and literature. Now, Singapore has often prided itself in leapfrogging the region to connect with other global cities elsewhere. How do you think this has affected the interpretation of our past?
Yeah, it's affected the interpretation of our past in deeply profound ways. I think there's a very famous maxim that says 1819 was when we turned away from the Malay world, and 1965 was when we were severed from it completely. And in many ways, Singapore has never actually succeeded in being and in ripping itself free from the Malay world. In one way or another, the Malay world has continued to bleed in and shape it. Right. So even after 1819, 1824, when it became a colony, thousands of people from the archipelago continued to not just move to Singapore, but turned it into a thriving sort of center for Malay popular culture, Malay political ideas, and Malay intellectual movements as well, right? So even though we were, quote, turned away from the Malay world because we were made into a British colony, it was ironically this atmosphere of being free from the feudal Malay courts that enabled Singapore to become one of the premier sites of Malay modernity. So that's one. And then secondly, even in independent Singapore, or rather should I say post-separation Singapore, after separation from Malaysia, I mean, yeah, Singapore has always tried to, position itself as being exceptional. Oh, we're a shining city in a bad neighborhood. Oh, we're different because we're able to attract, foreign investment, and we belong to a global sort of network of world trade, etc. We're not bound by the region and its backwardness. But I mean, just by the very fact of us having this anxiety, of wanting to stand out, and this is and how that's reflected in our policy as well. This constant fear, this siege mentality of being swallowed up, by either Indonesia or Malaysia, shows that you can't deny the geopolitical reality of being in the Malay world, right? And because you can't escape that fact, you distort the region, right? You position them as being, it's a dangerous region. These expansionist Indonesians are always trying to swallow up the red dot. These radical Islamists will create instability. Oh, we're a Chinese dot in a Malay sea. I mean, again, this constant language, often with racist undertones, is reflective of this anxiety that of being unable to quite deny the fact that you are in this cultural region from which you are alienated. Actually, when you look at the realities on the ground, I mean, the cultural influences endure, right? I mean, so again, as I talk about in my chapter, I mean, it's not just the Peranakans, right? Peranakan Indians, Peranakan Arabs, Peranakan Chinese, but even the more quote unquote recent migrants of Chinese Indians, their modes of speech, their sort of tastes and appetites and habits and customs and manners, I mean, in some in ways big or small, are inflected by the cultural influences of the Malay world. And I mean, you could really go at length about this, whether you look at dress or whatever. I mean, yeah. And in many ways, this was also deliberate. So in the 50s and in the 50s and 60s, during the anti-colonial period movement, the very fact that so many, Chinese students were clamoring to learn Malay because they believed that this was the rightful national language of a future independent Malayan state, is already indicative of this, desire to embed oneself in the Malay world. This aspect of Merdeka is, of course, something that post-separation Singapore has completely disavowed, because it's been reduced to this, oh yeah, we learned Malay back in the day because, we had ties with Malaysia and it was pragmatic to do so. After we separated, it was not pragmatic to learn Malay, so we learned English instead. I mean, completely kind of overshadowing the very real ideological reasons underlying why people did this, right? Because they saw themselves as being in a Malay world. And that was kind of translated into a political vision. What was the other question? Interpretation of our past. Right. And so the other kind of problem also is kind of this averseness or this reluctance to take ownership of Singapore's historical embeddedness in the Malay world. So be it in secondary school history or even authoritative academic histories, there has always been a tendency to privilege migratory paths in the shaping of Singapore in the region. So if you look at a lot of these books like Singapore and the Silk Road of the Sea, or a lot of work done on 14th century Singapore, there's this one powerful narrative about, oh yeah, Southeast Asia and Singapore were prosperous because Ming China was on the rise. And because of Ming China, that drove trade in the region. China declined, then Southeast Asia also declined. It's like we're always kind of like our rhythms are dictated by China. We don't have our own, as if the Malay world didn't have its own kind of patterns of trade, etc. Professor O.W. Walters, this very important historian of Srivijaya, had this wonderful way of putting it. He said, the Malay world had its own momentum. And a lot of these histories about early modern Singapore for some reason, always need to kind of situate it within these global trade networks. Oh, yeah, we were linked to China, we were linked to India, blah, blah, blah. But never sort of embedding it within interpolity trade within the Malay world. And that actually has been a far more immediate dimension in shaping Singapore trade. Not, of course, not denying the fact that it was, part of an international trading system, but I mean, for some reason, there's always this impulse to elide its connections to the regional. So that's one. And of course, there's this other problem, right? Because when you talk about how Singapore was in a Malay world, then, oh no, you are denying the contributions of the other ethnic communities in shaping Singapore's history. And then it becomes like, and then there's this sort of fear of privileging Malays, saying that, oh yeah, only Malays built Singapore. So we are always, whenever we look into our past, we are always haunted by the specter of racial harmony. Oh yeah, all the races have to contribute equally to Singapore. So we can't talk about this past as being like, we can't acknowledge that it was part of a Malay world, blah, 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 because then you are sort of legitimizing the Malay nationalist narrative that Singapore was always part of, was always a Malay country, blah, blah, blah. But of course, as we see, this was not a zero-sum game. It's not mutually exclusive. Being in a Malay world doesn't mean that there were no Chinese and Indians or other ethnic communities. I mean, you were all already here, right? The Malay world was always a cosmopolitan place and always shaped by, cross-cultural currents. So there doesn't, there's nothing to fear when we talk about Singapore's history as being part of the history of the Malay world. We're not denying the contributions of non-Malays. So yeah, I think that's actually a more empowering way to look at it, right? That Singapore was already part of a thriving indigenous network before the colonial period that was already cosmopolitan and involved so many different cultural communities.
That was a very detailed explanation of, the history of the Malay world and its relations to Singapore. Academics such as Syed Hussein Alatas and Lili Zubaida Rahim have written extensively before about Singapore's relations with its Malay community and the wider Malay world. So what can younger academics such as yourself do to move the conversation forward?
Thanks for that question. I mean, I think, of course, Lili Rahim and Syed Hussein Alatas are scholars that I personally look up to as exemplars, really. I mean, the kind of pioneering work that they do to push the conversation on, not just the effects of colonialism on the way we think about race, but also how racialized marginality continues to debilitate Malays in Singapore today. What I feel, I think is important to do in this period is to really look back at the early modern period. A lot of the scholarship done by thinkers like Hussein Alatas and Lili Rahim are very contemporary. So the kind of they of course they do reference, kind of give a historical background, of Malay society and things like that. Hussein Alatas looks at the colonial period, so very 19th century. But I think more intervention needs to be made, kind of looking at the early modern period, because you can't study the modern Malay world without looking at the pre-modern, because there are these continuities involved, firstly, and there are ways in which fundamental breaks happen. And looking at those breaks is also important. So, for example, if you look at Hussein Alatas' myth of the lazy native, the idea of the lazy Malay is a very 19th century phenomenon. You can say, okay, maybe late 18th, probably. But prior to that, if you're looking at the 16th and 17th century Dutch and Portuguese records, you don't find any lazy Malays. Throughout the Straits of Malacca, you see wealthy Malay port kingdoms, and there are Malay craftsmen, Malay traders, whatever. And there are Malays busy doing all sorts of economic activities, weaving, carving, whatever, building things. But for some reason, from the late 18th century onwards, there's this shift. There's this talk of, why are the Malays so lazy, blah, 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 in comparison to other groups in the region, notably the hardworking Chinese, which is another colonial myth. And that kind of historicization has not been extensively done. So people kind of take it for granted referencing Hussein Alatas saying that, the Europeans have always thought of the Malays as lazy. Well, not quite. I mean, if you look at the earlier periods when Europeans had to deal with powerful Malay trading states, there were no. Of course, they didn't talk about Malays in this way. And the reasons why the Europeans started to develop this idea of the lazy Malay also needs to be examined. So, the declining status of the Malay kingdoms is one, but also developments of ideas in Europe, right? About race, about climate, about, whatever. So this is, the Enlightenment and how that affects, things happening in Southeast Asia. And also, I think it's important because, again, like I mentioned in my previous response, having a grasp of this history is also important in our own, in moving forward in our present, because there's this tendency to look at the pre-colonial Malay world as a racially authentic world, that there were just Malays and no one else. And that is also a colonial kind of construct, right? This idea that there were just these Malays, maybe a few Chinese here and there doing trade, blah, 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 economic backbone. And then all of a sudden the colonialists came, and then economic activity skyrocketed because they brought in all these migrant labor. And that's kind of poisoned the well of discussion in a lot of contexts in present day Malaysia and Singapore, because we think of our national histories with reference to these kind of migratory narratives, that there was nothing here, right? There were just these despotic, tyrannical Malay kings ruling, and then all of a sudden migrant communities came and then made us all rich, which is of course false. So if you look at the early modern Malay world, again, you see thriving economic systems, you see a sophisticated urban cultures in ports like Malacca, Palembang, Aceh, shaped by these very global networks of exchange. So there was the fact that there was already wealth accumulation happening before the colonial rulers arrived is not something that many people can fathom. There are reports. French diamond merchant Jacques de Coutre talks about, even ordinary people in the Malay ports wearing sumptuous clothing. So there was, there are indications of there having been a culture of mass consumption, and you can't have a culture of mass consumption if you didn't have, things like trade, etc. So that helps us shift the way we understand history in the present. That when we think about colonialism as the thing that brought economic development to this part of the world, I mean, patently false when you study the early modern period. So that's why I think, not a lot of people are really interested in what happens here before the 19th century, but it's actually very important